I read through the original version of the Feingold McCain Act concerning electoral campaign finance reform. There was more than one version that was presented through the Congress. It was not passed. Specifically, in one of those versions, there was discussion around capping when it came to campaign contributions available to presidential candidates. Now, the understanding I have is that when one acknowledges and runs for the office of the president, it is as if for a period of time regarding the formal declaration as well as the process through which one registers in order to run, there is a sort of pooling that happens of presidential or potential presidential assets. This is specifically in regards to if one declares, at least in the United States, as a member of a political party. I believe that if one reads through the original text of the Feingold McCain Act, that one actually sees that you actually see that that's explicated. It discusses specific limits, and those limits have specific implications. During the 2020 presidential election season, beginning in the early 2019, there were more than 20 candidates identified as running for the office of the president in the Democratic Party in the United States. If I recall, the first announcement was that there were going to be 23 Democratic candidates. I recall because while I personally was in the situation I was in, there were advertisements on TV leading up to what turned out to be a series of town halls provided by CNN for certain Democratic candidates. It was understood from the onset CNN was not going to offer any airtime to any Republican candidates, only Democratic candidates. There was town halls in the form of individual town hall presentations that certain candidates were offered. There were also debates of a sort, or rather a more collective platform in terms of how candidates could present their perspective. But the concern I had at the time was, what does it mean that more than 20 people between 24 and 27, or 23 and 27 at any given time, at least at the onset, had declared their intent to run for the office of the President of the United States? I contend this was a very strategic decision that had a variety of implications, not all of which served the best interests of the people of the United States. But that would be an opinion. What I'm more concerned about is that overwhelming majority of those candidates were also concurrently in Congress or in the Senate. That they were running for the president while they were also in office at the time. This brings up a very real concern of how a candidate for an office, including incumbency or potentially a higher office, may manipulate what they're supposed to be doing in performance of their actual government duties as representatives of the people as part of some sort of ambition to seek higher office. Now, this goes back a long time. This isn't a new phenomenon. But there is a very significant concern about what it means to have access to those sorts of resources when you're engaged in an alleged electoral campaign, and what you consider to be risk associated with engaging unconventional tactics or even losing. You have a different consideration of the risk to you and your constituents when you already know, well, if I do not succeed at this stage of campaigning, I've already got this office for this amount of time. Then there's the consideration of what it means to declare your intent to run for a higher office while you're concurrently serving in or potentially also running for or listed as running for a lower office. Different states have different laws regarding these versus the federal government. But I'm more concerned with who do you allow to provide you with actual money. During the 2020 presidential election season, it was on the record, it was publicly acknowledged, it was even presented before Congress and the Senate, that there were 4 major auditing firms and accounting firms that were at that time already contracted with the Pentagon to provide an audit of the Pentagon. All 4 of those firms, but certain of them specifically, contributed to the electoral candidates of people running for office at various levels of public office. I contend this is not only illegal in so far as there would have been an appropriate application of law concerning conflicts of interest, especially in regards to what they were doing at that time, but it's completely unethical and disingenuous when it comes to whatever it is they're intending to do in their public service. How is it that the government appropriates for the audit of defense-related spending and contracting, and candidates for political office are also allowed to take donations from those same auditing firms while they're running for office? Some of these are very substantial, and some of them are not just to individuals, but rather to local committees or local organizations that represent the party, or to and through PACs. How can we rely on the integrity of an audit provided by a company that is also creating their own specific kind of metric scheme that they use as part of their financial activities, not only during that election season, but at other times at the same time? Now, I have been tracking specific companies, two specifically. One, because I had no choice. One, because I understand at some point in time they identified me as an asset for some of their preferred candidates and decided part of the way they were going to contribute to their political campaigns or attempt to acquire whatever it was they were expecting in return for their investment was to use me as part of the audit. I kept track of that the best I could. But these specific companies would also potentially present conflicts of interest to candidates when it came to them performing their duties regarding tax policy. For several years, there has been a very disturbing trend. There has been a bill that has been proposed over and over again. It does not make it out of committee. I noticed it for 2 full congressional cycles. Stop Subsidizing Multi-Million-Dollar Corporate Bonuses Act. Now, in the text of this specific act, it discusses elements of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act specific to clawback provisions regarding executive compensation. I contend that this is highly and incredibly disingenuous. What has happened instead is that members specifically of the Democratic Party have been using this specific proposed piece of legislation that has never been passed, or if I recall, has never even been put before a full vote, to engage in acts of political reprisal against opposition and to use it to effectively launder assets of people who would otherwise be their constituents or could even potentially be their political opposition. Not necessarily acrimonious, mind you, just people with a different political perspective attempting to engage in their own ordinary or even extraordinary political process. They have been using this in acts of reprisal, and they've been using it in acts that are actually illegal. I watched for over a year while women that fit specific kinds of demographics at different stages ended up with the same medical injury. I contend that those women, including young women who were below the age of consent, by the way, were strategically targeted using technologies that not only I have been subjected to, but I understand can be applied in such a manner, to acquire a specific kind of medical injury that would then have a specific kind of coding on a billing record as a form of campaign contribution, and more than campaign contribution, a form of extortion in order to compel them into a situation where in the future they can be leaned on illegally. This involves terms that were never disclosed, that were never approved, and never would be because they're unconscionable and illegal. And yet year after year after year, the same Democrats end up proposing and sponsoring or co-sponsoring this bill. I watched for 2 election cycles. They started off with women that were above the age of consent, I contend, in order to refine and hone the tactics by which they acquired the specific injury at the specific time. Then I watched how after an alleged declaration of a state of emergency, they targeted minor young women who had a specific ethnic background. Now, during this time, I have not had any of my reports to any federal or local agency responded to, including in manners and during time frames wherein refusal to respond compels a default that has not only financial consequences, but nonetheless, this specific act was proposed and allowed to languish and then reproposed. This happens very frequently. I contend what happens is certain bills get proposed during a session. There's a sponsor, and then certain co-sponsors sign on at a certain time in order to get an option for themselves. To them, it is not so important whether or not the bill gets passed, because once the bill has been sponsored, and once it has acquired some co-sponsors, and once it's been put into committee, all of those are economic events. Some of these bills end up actually being put into appropriations. I've been watching for several years. The text of the specific bill may not get passed as a bill, but what it discusses ends up in an appropriations bill in a specific section with a specific amount. Nonetheless, what happens to these bills? Presumably, after a session, if it hasn't been voted on, then it defaults into not being relevant. I contend that's not the truth. I contend they set up options. Was it the party? Is it the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee? Is it the auditing firms that provide campaign donations either to the individual candidates or to the party organizations? Is it a specific PAC? Is it a family member that has their own personal financial portfolio? And they develop as part of their financial portfolio options connected to sponsorships and co-sponsorships of that family member in political office. How many times do they identify people that would potentially be political opposition and say, I'm putting you in my hedge fund. You're my asset. Well, maybe you get somebody that's very productive. Well, you got to share that person. You can't claim exclusive access, or if you do, you only have it on a timeshare. I contend this is exactly what they've been doing. They haven't just been trafficking mortgage-backed securities. They've been trafficking people. People that otherwise would have been their constituents, including constituents that may have, I don't know, written a proposed piece of legislation, taken it to their office and said, I understand you're my senator. This is an important issue. I think this might be a good proposal as a piece of legislation in order to change laws that we need to have changed in order to provide for our welfare and safety. Well, that doesn't seem to be a very popular campaign strategy. Acknowledging that your constituents have those kinds of capabilities and that that's who you are and that's who you're representing. No, it would seem at this point who they are and who they're representing are hedge fund managers. Hedge fund managers that don't always perform adequately, and so they have to lean on and steal from their own people. I contend it's not only illegal to the letter of the law, but that it is destabilizing to not only the domestic United States political system, but also internationally. They've been talking about election interference, not only in the United States, but other countries for several years. I don't believe it's election interference. It's not that at all. They allowed for people to abuse their political office for a very long period of time in order to set up their own personal financial portfolio based on the abuse of their office, being able to access the human political capital of people that may not even be their constituents, but may have had some sort of asset they were interested in. And then through a variety of machinations that they were able to orchestrate in abuse of their office and try to claim for whatever reason it was out of their hands, including in a consideration of strategically coordinated votes on strategically coordinated days in order to calibrate the metrics associated with that particular issue. They've been trafficking us. Who has an interest in monopolizing the political capital of federal legislatures and federal executive offices and obstructing and sabotaging judicial process in order to strip down the political capital of the planet so significantly? It has literally been abused in such a significant manner that they're using biological weapons in order to try to program us into a very, very bad misrepresentation of a viable planned economy. I believe that this particular bill is a crime. I believe that everybody that signed on to that bill knew it was a crime. They knew it was a crime when it was first proposed, when it was proposed the second time, when it was proposed the third time. Apparently, it's been proposed more than that, and apparently, right now, there is an actively pending version of this bill. Do they just recirculate it every year and develop a new diabolical means by which to torment people under the auspices of some sort of multi-million-dollar corporate bonus? They don't actually apply law in assuring that illegal financial practices, including consolidation of assets used in creation of wealth, are not rendered into the exclusive realm of people that are able to back themselves with some form of insurance connected to campaign contributions, then there's nothing legitimate about this. I've been watching it for years. Nobody's responded. Are they doing something with that today? You see, they've already done enough to take care of themselves, but there's one thing they still have not been able to cover. Was the assassination of the president of Haiti not enough to fill what they expected when it came to quality indicators for the Presidential Pension Fund? Is that what we got going on right now? Do you need more people to step up into candidacy for political office so that you can kidnap them and torture them and steal their lives and try to create some sort of profile that might please whoever it was that's already purchased their political favor, including under the auspices of providing some alleged intelligence role, including an intelligence role that has been able to watch people since they were children grow up, create political capital with other people, and then consolidate those assets for themselves and those people that bought in with them earlier on? It is unacceptable. Deloitte, Booz Allen Hamilton, KPMG, and other companies that were auditing the Pentagon, including one whose name at the moment I cannot remember, should not have been allowed to make campaign contributions to anybody during the 2018 or 2020 election season. It was completely disgraceful and unacceptable that while they're auditing the national defense structure of the United States, they're also able to buy kickbacks through and bribes through campaign contributions. We had an entire year last year where there was frivolous, or rather dangerous, efforts to abuse the judicial system with litigation that was completely disingenuous. I contend that's panning out right now. And not only is it panning out domestically, I contend it was set up in order to try to interfere with electoral politics in other countries, including in manners that are attempting to extort heads of state or future heads of state, as well as legislators, into agreeing to compromise the safety and welfare of their own people in order to pay off somebody else's large-scale, high-risk, illegal finance scheme. It's not appropriate to arrest political candidates, put a bail bond on them, lean on them, and then destroy their assets because you're upset at somebody else. Lloyd Doggett, I contacted you directly in 2017. I've contacted you more than once. You need to turn yourself in today, Lloyd. You have no right to misrepresent the people of Texas and to misrepresent anybody with this farce that you promote over and over and over again. And you owe restitution to those women in Houston. You owe restitution to those women throughout the country that have been targeted by companies and organizations based out of Houston.